tape number 402, dated August 17th, 1979, and this is side 1, Mae Brussell from Carmel, California. I promised last April, tape 383, that I would give an overview of history. I've received many letters from people asking for just a general overview of how we got into the mess we're in today. And, of course, my overview is an interpretation based upon my research that began with the assassination of John Kennedy. I'm going to try to do 3 tapes for you, no more than that. It's a good opportunity this summer to do this for you. Take the time to do it and get away from just Lee Harvey Oswald or whatever it is, the news of the weeks. And for the next 3 weeks and with this tape, try to give you just some dates. It's an impossible job to give you all the dates I have or think are important. I've tried to condense some that I think are important, to pinpoint some of the events in history that have altered today's newspaper that you open up today. Now, my work is specifically the areas of murders and the consequences, the meetings of people, their motives, and the organizations behind the power organizations or institutions. I'm not going into battle lines or the victory of a particular war or where the soldiers were at a certain date or when they were defeated. In most cases, that is not what I'm going to put down for you. And I have a library of thousands of books and many, many thousands of files. I simply have to condense what I think are some important dates. These events have something to do with people who want to become wealthy, people who have wealth and want to maintain it, the institutions by which they protect it, whether they grab or steal or exploit it, the armies with the means by which they kill their opposition, whether it's soldiers or police, and the courts that protect them from illegalities, and the machinery by which courts are turned around so that these particular, whether they're monarchies or presidents, in order to have that power, if they usurped it through murders and crimes, the courts cover up for them. There's a lot left out of here, but I make no apologies. I think that some of these dates you'll find interesting, and I'm going to share them with you. Before I begin, I would just like to do about 2 minutes on history and my view of history before we run down these dates. I sincerely believe that the worst enemy isn't any particular country or person. It isn't Alexander Haig or J. Edgar Hoover or Allen Dulles. It isn't an agency like the Defense Industry Security Command or the CIA or the National Security Agency. Institutions exist because they're made up of people, and they exist because we allow them to. When we put the power into their hands, it's theirs. This happens because people are afraid, because they're stupid, they don't care, or they don't care enough. When they care enough, it changes. When the French decided they had enough of the kings and queens, they had a revolution. When America had enough of Great Britain, they had a revolution. When the Bolsheviks had enough of the Tsar and the Tsar's army, they had a revolution. Nicaragua got rid of the Somozas. They should have gotten their smarts the day he was in, or the day that he began to acquire all the wealth and industry and means of support of that country. And many, many people have died needlessly because they didn't catch on and they just gave too much rope to this leader and that family. And when people have had enough, that's it. The Bible begins, and I always refer to this because I like it, the forbidden fruit is knowledge. Why did the power structure write that? Who had the printing press? Then, and today it's the establishment, they wrote that knowledge is a sin. Knowledge actually is freedom, and they don't want you to know it, and ignorance is slavery. And I sincerely believe that our own worst problem is ourselves. It's in ourselves, and that if we can't work that out, we can't get to the solution of a lot of things. That's why the Bible begins with Cain and Abel. When the brothers are fighting each other, instead of the two brothers fighting the warriors that are coming in to rape the town and the women and pollute their land, then they're in trouble. When brother fights brother, you're in trouble, and strength comes in love and being together, and the divisions are what allow the power structure to get a hold of us. I actually do believe that. I believe the problems of this country go back to the slave policy with the blacks and the genocide policy with the Indians and the importation of the Chinese and with the railroads bringing them in. There's a man, Ben Wattenberg, who wrote an article in the magazine section of the New York Times. This is July 22nd, 1977. It's called "It's Time to Stop America's Retreat," and he talks about defeat in Vietnam and mercenaries in Africa, and people are on the radio talking about oil and energy in the Middle East. It's my view of history that we can't stop retreating until we look in the mirror and make some changes. If you want to make yourself over, you look in the mirror. You don't turn your back to the mirror if you want to change. And until we examine our past, we can't go further, and eventually it's going to kill us. The cities will all burn, and the discord here is turning to hatred just like it did in Germany. It's very basic. It's combined with our guilt and our hate. Looking at the people we brought in, the Mexicans, the Chicanos, and now the Indonesians, and not being able to handle our exploitation of them and rationalize it with the stated goals of the American dream. The other side of the coin, because things aren't all bad, is somebody like Joseph Papp from New York City. In the same issue, the New York Times, this Broadway producer said that he's putting on plays, $3 million into what is going to be the finest Shakespearean company in the world. He's going to take it to England. It's going to start in New York, and it's going to be black, Hispanic, and Asian. And Joseph Papp states that he said the political situation in New York is partly responsible for my having a black company. I live in New York City where blacks are powerless and Puerto Ricans and Asians are powerless. We all suffer, and it's bad for the city because the frustration is going to build up. There has to be an outlet. You can make people equal culturally, and you don't have to pass laws to give them equality. He said the theater is my way of doing it. Now, whether you're a merchant in a retail business, or whether you're a plumber or a real estate agent, or belong to an electricity union, whatever you do, if each agency had the philosophy of Joseph Papp and began to incorporate into our society and learn from other people, fine people, and help those stop the narcotics, the drugging, and the alcohol that goes to the Indians and blacks and incorporate them into our system, America would begin to solve her problems. So long as we hate, we will build agencies to defend our wrongness, and we will have dictators and people over us who, because of their general hatred, do not do things that benefit this country, laws, decisions, and wars. It all comes out of hatred and racism and genocide, and it didn't begin with Adolf Hitler. Genocide began many places with the Spanish going over to South America and Central America, and with our American Indians right here. So we'll just limit it to what's going on right here for the time being. There are two ways to study history, and you can't do one at the expense of the other. They have to go on at the same time. You can take the chronology of a life, such as Henry Luce, or John Kennedy, or Lee Harvey Oswald, or Adolf Hitler, or Aristotle Onassis, and you can go from birth to grave. I just finished reading this week the biography of George Orwell. You can carry them from birth to grave. But then you have to take those dates and slice them off, type them up and put on a piece of paper, and then slice them, and then put them into chronological order into the year so that you know where these people were, and at the time they were at that place, what else was going on in the world. It seems that this is the best way to study history. It's never been taught in the schools, but in order to understand history and the lives of individuals and how the lives are affected and how they're moved around by the movers, you have to place them into these time slots rather than that lineal view of studying the biography of George Washington or Benjamin Franklin. That's why we were taught school Abraham Lincoln, but we weren't taught what else was going on in the world while Abraham Lincoln was president of the United States. My sources of information for this chronology come from my own books, my own files, newspapers, government documents, and material that many of you have sent to me. I'm appreciative for it. I've included it in here, and you will recognize a lot of it. There's a writer, Sidney Lenz, who published an article in 1973 called How It Really All Began, and he's written some books on American labor, American empire. And the gist of this article was that Vietnam is no accident, but the inevitable result of a policy pattern of the American economic establishment. And he takes issue with David Halberstam, who wrote The Best and the Brightest, that Vietnam was a fluke or a mistake, that good people went wrong. And I totally agree with Sidney Lin's view of history, that what has been going on in the conniving and the murdering and the coups, and those are the areas I really am interested in, the assassinations of public officials or the witnesses to those murders, and the coups, the overthrow of government to take it from a moderate or a conservative government to a police state of fascism. When I talk about coups in this chronology, they'll all be going from the middle to the right. None that I'm listing go from middle to the left. And the assassinations and the coups are the result of planning. We didn't just wake up one morning in 1941 and find that our ships were bombed in Pearl Harbor. That's what happened to most of us. We woke up and found out it was during the daytime. The news came on about the war starting, the Japanese blowing up our ships at Pearl Harbor. There wasn't any history taught, any of us that I know of, really on the background of Pearl Harbor that would explain how this event took place. There's one other thing I want to mention before I run down the events of history, which really has nothing to do with the chronology, but it has to do with the Jewish-Christian phenomena, because through this chronology you'll hear me speaking a lot about Nazis and how they've affected our culture since 1912 up to the present time and certainly into the future. The Jewish religion, for some reason or other, produced 4 people who altered the entire course of history, for better or for worse. They could have been used, I give the example, if you go out to a fine meal and you're dining and you're using a knife and fork, the tools that are invented make a very pleasant evening. But in another place, in another time, somebody is taking the knife and fork and still killing a member of their family or a friend or associate, and they can stab with the same knife and fork you can kill. So it depends on which way you use the tools. But going back to the early problems of that later developed into this Nazi anti-Semitic regime, Jesus, the Jew, and fighting the Romans, and then Christianity based upon the life of a Jewish hippie type, living a very simple life. Christianity was the excuse for the rape of the world. They took that, Middle Ages, the Inquisition, and up to the present day. Various sects of the Christian church have been the excuse for the rape and the murder of people high up in the ruling class, the ruling families. The most outrageously rich and prosperous are also the most religious. It was Jesus versus the Romans that set up the religious conflicts, and Karl Marx set up the conflict of money in the present times. I say there was the French Revolution, the American Revolution, but not till Karl Marx came along was it death to the finish, even doomsday bombs to kill everybody in the world, or this LSD and these chemicals at BZ that is stockpiled, I mentioned last week, in 3 different places, enough to outdo the minds of the entire world population 10 times over. Karl Marx came along and presented a new idea as against the monarchies and the ruling class, and money became the reason for raping and polluting the world after Karl Marx. The matters got worse once Karl Marx emerged. And then Sigmund Freud showed up in Vienna and introduced the concept of the mind, the free mind, the conscious mind, the unconscious mind. And the church had control of the mind for the most part. The church did control our thinking, whether it's Jew or Gentile in this case. The mind, to free the mind or to change the mind and alter the mind, became the consuming desire of John Foster Dulles and Alan Dulles, going from Freud to Carl Jung up to the present day and projecting it to the future of reading our minds, directing our minds. Sigmund Freud opened up the levels of the mind, and then Albert Einstein in Germany brought in the nuclear energy as against cosmic energy of Wilhelm Reich, which one ended up dead in an Arizona jail over some fluky charge, and which one ended up the hero of the 20th century. Of course, Albert Einstein, the destructive energy, the energy maybe that could be used for something valuable that is polluting the streams and the rivers and possibly all the oceans and the air and the atmosphere, used wrong. These were the basic revolutions. I think the Christian religion, after they killed Jesus, the communist revolution after Karl Marx came, the revolution of the mind and of energy. And these are the things for which people fight and abuse each other and are literally killing people off on planet Earth by the millions, almost daily. Thousands of people are dying from one form of disease or hunger, or the boat people, or Pakistan, or famines created even by satellites or solar energy. The Earth is being abused because these contributions were abused, and these are really basically what the fight is over: religion, money, mind, and energy. The chronology I'm going to give you on dates is only going to be years. It's not going to be dates or months, because I don't have time to separate that for you right now. It's really a hard project. I don't have a staff or secretary where I'd put them all in index cards in chronological order. But before we get into those hunks of years and the way events moved up on us, like the sludge moving out of New York City towards the shore, I just want to give one brief example of the chronological history that I mentioned, and specifically take the person of John Kennedy. You can study his personal life, a linear chronology, which I have a list here of important dates. You can study the chronology of his specific foreign affairs, his contributions, his efforts, his mistakes, his major decisions in the foreign affairs, and then I have a list chronologically of his domestic bills, why he was killed and what he was doing domestically. I think his domestic bills were superior, his foreign affairs were blunders, and he was totally ignorant of the forces around him. John Kennedy survived an attack on his boat when he was in the war, World War, in the Navy, but even though he could swim to shore and save himself there, and he wrote a book, Profiles of Courage, and he studied history, he didn't have the overview of history, or he would have run scared or changed the institutions. He fell right into their lap and was swept up in the sludge, just as George McGovern was swept up in the elections when he ran against the Watergate team. John Kennedy simply didn't have the right, the right oars to swim against these forces. Chronologically, you say he was born in May 29th, 1979, my birthday. He went to Stanford University in 1940. I went there from 40 to 43, but I didn't know John Kennedy. Summer of 40, I was there. I didn't know John Kennedy was there. Graduate School of Business in the fall of 1940. He left in 41 and went to South America. In 1937, his father had been the ambassador to the court of St. James. He was brought home by J. Edgar Hoover because he was so pro-Nazi, Joe Kennedy, that it was embarrassment to the United States to be that Nazi overtly, just quietly. In 1944, Joe Kennedy Jr. was killed over Europe on a dangerous mission. In 1946, John Kennedy was elected to Congress, and when we go into those years, important years, I'll show you how important it is to put him into that time slot of who else went to Congress in 1946, and then he began serving in January 47. 1948, his sister was killed in an airplane crash in France. In 1951, he met Jacqueline Bouvier. An article in the paper in July by Ellen Goodman on Jacqueline Bouvier, Kennedy, saying Jacqueline is fundamentally a mystery. No matter how many books are written about her, we can't find the clues. We have a mystery without a motive, is the description of Jacqueline Onassis. That it's a question asking who she is, what kind of a person she is, what does she represent, and the more pieces you get, little do you know. To say that he married Bouvier in 51 is a fact, but a little background on the Bouvier family and the movements of Jacqueline Onassis explain maybe the answers to the mystery that Ellen Goodman was writing for in the newspaper. But he married her in 53. In 57, he was investigating the Senate Permanent Committee hearing on labor racketeering. In 1960, an important date, and we will again go back and put in its time slot, John Kennedy said, "I'm announcing my candidacy for President of the United States." By July 14th, 1960, Robert Mayu was at the Plaza Hotel working with the assassination teams that were, in quotes, against Fidel Castro. They were the CIA and organized crime, making a marriage between those two in July 1960. But this young person, John Kennedy, had announced in January of 60 he was going to run for President of the United States. Now, earlier, in 1952, John Kennedy went to the Senate where he represented Massachusetts, and he defeated Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. was involved with the murder and the cover-up of DM in Southeast Asia just 30 days before John Kennedy was killed, and Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. was opponent of John Kennedy for the seat in the Senate in Massachusetts. He was defeated by John Kennedy in the Senate, but he goes on to be involved with the assassination teams of his opponent in 1960. Furthermore, in the time slot, this junior, the son of Henry Cabot Lodge, was the man who sabotaged the peace plans of Woodrow Wilson at the end of World War I. He was in charge of the Foreign Relations Committee in the House or Senate, and he was the opponent of Woodrow Wilson, who had been poisoned in France and was dying. Then Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. is defeated by John Kennedy and is in Vietnam, and you can read all of this in the Pentagon Papers. I'm not giving the sources for the dates, but history becomes very interesting when you interweave what these people were doing, what their brothers were doing, their children were doing. The apples didn't fall very far from the tree, and then history really gets into a can of worms when you add Ms. Bouvier and the Onassis Churchill connections to the John Kennedy story. So by January 60, he was going to announce his candidacy for president. In July 13th, 1960, he received the nomination for president on the first ballot, and it was July 14th, that one day later, that Robert Mayu from the Central Intelligence Agency and the FBI is meeting with the assassination teams. John Kennedy was having his debates with Richard Nixon, who was running for president of the United States against him. Richard Nixon lost that election and was in Dallas the day that Kennedy was killed, and worked closely with Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. in that group. His television debates were going on, but Kennedy didn't know that the invasion was being planned for the Bay of Cubes, with Richard Nixon as the director of that. And when Kennedy pulled back, that was excuse or motivation for the assassination teams to work with the CIA and organized crime and kill John Kennedy. His inauguration was 1961, January the 30th, 1961. February 1961, 1 month later, Patrice Lumumba was killed in the Congo by the Central Intelligence Agency. The teams that were set up overtly when you're meeting in hotel rooms with organized crime and the CIA, that's pretty overt almost. It's not even in little halls of the intelligence community. The Bay of Pigs took place in April of 61, and then Bay of Pigs operators and agents were involved in the assassination of John Kennedy later, as I said. In May of 1961, John Kennedy was meeting with Charles de Gaulle in France. Neither of them were aware till later that Permindex and the Defense Industry Security Command that succeeded in killing John Kennedy was also planning and lost several attempts to kill de Gaulle. He was singled out to be murdered also. John Kennedy met with Khrushchev in 1961. He didn't take the lesson from Eisenhower and the Khrushchev summit meeting that was downed in 1960 with the involvement of Lee Harvey Oswald and Gary Powers in the Soviet Union. He was meeting with Khrushchev trying to make a peace or détente of a sort, and then the same Lee Harvey Oswald that helped sabotage the U-2 meetings in 1960 is at Dealey Plaza and the alleged assassin and patsy to cover up the Mayu teams that killed John Kennedy. If this is getting a little complicated, you'll just have to replay the tape over and transcribe it yourself, because it's going to go fast, and I'm throwing out names for New listeners, I'm not defining Mayu and certainly not Khrushchev or Gary Powers. You'll simply have to go to your libraries and read your books on each one of them. In 1963, December 1st, 1963, or November 30th, Diem was murdered in Southeast Asia. And, of course, that was set up by the Central Intelligence Agency and Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr., and high officials of the Pentagon. And at that time, John Kennedy's assassination was planned for that same weekend in Chicago, but was put off 1 month later because he didn't go to the Army-Navy football game. But John Kennedy was murdered in 1963. So you put him in a time slot with a literal volcano of energy, of plans, connivings, of plans to kill Castro, to kill Lumumba, to kill de Gaulle, to kill Dag Hammarskjöld, to kill Diem, and to break up the Khrushchev meetings. And you put him into that time slot opposing Henry Cabot Lodge and Richard Nixon and Robert Mayu, who represents the Howard Hughes Aerospace and the CIA and FBI. And when you run down the chronology of this young man, and he was the youngest president of the United States, and put into time slots, you get two different views, but I don't have to overemphasize the point of the can of worms that John Kennedy was sitting in. Now I'm going to try the almost impossible, but do the best I can to run down some important events. Let me reiterate again as we run through this tape and the next several tapes that if I mention a date or an event, it may be just one section from an entire book or files. It's not complete. It's just to give you an overview of history. And the earliest date, I can't go back to the Romans or Jesus. I'm going to start with 1826 when the Freemasons and the Illuminati were gathered together as a secret society, and a William Morgan, a writer, was murdered in 1826 because he started to reveal the secrets of an organization known as the Freemason Society. I have a lot of material on Masonic assassinations. Jumping to 1830, which wasn't far behind, 4 years later, was Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon Church, getting his laws and revelations. I select this particular event because of the power and control of the Mormon Church today, the data banks of everyone on planet Earth going back to the year 600, Mormon, non-Mormon, Orientals, Chinese, the continuation of the Nazi genealogy, the Interpol, or they were certainly forming their data banks before Meyer Heydrich, the blending of the police departments, the computers, the information that is a microfilm in those rocks that should be blown up to smithereens and discarded. It was all put together, accumulated through the years, and just several years after this particular person died for revealing the secrets of the Freemasons, Joseph Smith got his miraculous revelations into what was to become the Mormon Church, and then the Mormon Church went on to become the front for the Central Intelligence Agency and took over the entire Howard Hughes body and empire, and the building the Mormon Mafia, controlling the interests or the power behind the Lockheed, the U-2 flights, the Hughes Enterprise, simply chauffeurs and what do they call them, gophers, the men that go for this and go for that, became the heads of this huge Hughes empire, and there are many, many books on the CIA and the Hughes Mafia, so that right after the secrecy of the Illuminati story or trying to reveal it, Joseph Smith gets his wonderful vision. And so shortly after that, a few years later, was the Civil War in the United States in 1838 when slavery was abolished. If the South had won the Civil War, they would have direct connections with France and England, but the power structure was splattered, and then the North made their connections with those countries when it was over. There was an effort when the war was over to block further revolutions and to destroy the South, give them as little industry as possible, don't build them up, break up this mass of territory and keep them dependent upon the North. Battle of the Civil War is still going on in this country. As I say, the weapon industry came to those areas that were not developed and not socially sophisticated and didn't have the culture. The education in Europe were kept somewhat provincial, and their educational level, their provincialism, was combined with their slave mentality, their attitude in the South towards slavery and blacks and Mexicans coming in, and this has affected our political decisions today and the way we handle people around the world. In 1860, Tsar Alexander II from Russia and the United States were close. President Lincoln had signed an alliance that saved the United States through the Civil War, and Russia was working with Abraham Lincoln and the government, and through that Russia began to get advanced technology, which they needed. By 1862, the Nobel family began their oil development. Alfred Nobel, Ludwig Nobel, and Robert Nobel. Their father built armaments and gunpowder and heavy machinery industries, and Emmanuel Nobel invented underwater mines, which eventually led to the defeat of the British in the Baltic and Crimean Sea. The Nobel oil is important. Most of the names and dates go chronologically up to my work, as I say, linked to the Kennedy assassination, because George DeMohrenschildt, Lee Harvey Oswald's closest friend and contact in the Dallas-Fort Worth area for the CIA, was the son of Mr. von Mohrenschildt, who managed the Nobel oil fields in Baku in Russia and before the Soviet Union was formed, so that there was a link of the DeMohrenschilds to the Nobel oil interest. In 1872, Robert Nobel established oil refineries in Baku. That's where DeMohrenschildt's father was to be manager of those. And Ludwig Nobel went to Baku, and they built their pipelines. They got the idea of transporting through pipes and rail, and built a complicated rail transport and storage system for handling of oil. And this is just at the time the Industrial Revolution was really to break open. The U.S. oil industry in 1876 was observed by Russia, and the Cossacks had invented the first oil tankers, and they found the sulfuric acid for refining kerosene, and they began to upgrade the labor movement slowly in the Baku oil fields at least. In 1877, at the time this was going on, Standard Oil was beginning its muscles and had gained national ascendancy in the oil market. At this same time, Cecil Rhodes is going to be putting up money to expand British rule throughout the world, and Standard Oil in the United States is opening up as against the Soviet oil for control of world oil. Before World War I and after 1871, during this process, Jews in Germany were getting some emancipation. They'd been citizens throughout the Middle Ages and through a large part of European history, and the Jewish culture became very strong in Germany from 1857 until 1919. The Jewish population in Vienna grew by more than 400%, and there were medical and legal persons. They became part of the cultural community and blended in where they'd been excluded up to that time in all societies. And at that time, then, the pan-German movement began, a counteract to them called the Volkisch, Volkisch. That was a anti-Semitic movement that began, and then secret cults began to spring up. Anti-Semitic nationalistic cults were forming to oppose the success the Jews had in melting into the societies in Germany, particularly the medical institutions and the legal institutions and the businesses they were going into. There was a counteraction of the non-Jewish community to begin these cults that later were to incorporate Hitler. They were looking forward to what they called a Fuhrer. In 1890, there was an American faction. There was a group here that, as I say, assisted Russia with chemicals, oil, transportation. The United States was working with them. Up to that time, Great Britain had ruled the world as the empire, and they ruled the backward populations. They manipulated them. And in 1899, there was a depression. The English had opposed the Tsarist expansions. They didn't want them expanding their territory. They certainly can see why. Great Britain was very tiny and had been out exploring and expanding in Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Australia and Canada, and gaining a hold for its own prosperity. And this giant Russia, this huge landmass, was developing their own oil and railroads and oil tankers, which could be a big threat to the British Empire. In 1891, Cecil Rhodes was down in South Africa, and he, at that time, had control of 90% of the world's diamond supply. So Standard Oil, by the 1890s, had a big hand in American oil with a desire to grab the world's oils. There were the rich oil fields of Baku and in the southern part of the Soviet Union, and then the supply of diamonds was controlled by Cecil Rhodes, and he went on to become an important person in making a secret society to hold the British Empire and their gains. In 1901, the Rockefellers, Standard Oil, had enough money to begin their medical institute, and they founded the Rockefeller University in New York and the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research that is the leader in DNA that sends doctors and persons down to the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and God knows what they've come up with since 1901 when the oil people decided to get into the medical business. That's interesting because the Hughes Empire decided we'll open a medical institute later in 1956-57 in Miami, far away from Howard Hughes' home base, but these huge blocks decided they would have medical institutes. A man that was a doorman for an office building that was a medical institute in Florida with no qualifications at all became the head man. It's interesting that the oil people and the aerospace people decided early when they began to reap their profits to go into the medical business. With the escalation of cancer and diseases and pollutants in the air, you simply wonder what they did with all this money for, in quotes, medical research. I'll try not to make too many comments as I run down these dates, but I just want to bring it up to date because when an event took place back then, such as the Rockefellers starting a medical institute, and this is now 1979, it is appropriate to ask where it all went. But in 1903, Rasputin arrived in the Russian court. There are some books and literature to suggest that he was there to weaken the Soviet Union, and the stage was set for the 1905 invasion or war between Japan and Russia, at which time Russia was severely weakened and their fleet was cut off, and it was an attack against the Soviet Union, which made England and the other countries appear that or believe that the Soviet Union was weak and could be conquered. And there was this competition between the Standard Oil and later the Royal Dutch Shell, which is an important factor here with Queen Juliana and in the Netherlands. And the opinion was that Japan, by attacking the Soviet Union, knocking out the fleet, could stop some of their empirical grab, that the empire of Great Britain wouldn't be challenged. And the belief, as I say, was that the Rasputin was there to weaken the court if he could. In 1901, the Baku oil fields, Baku fields in Russia, were producing 1/2 of the world's population. And as I say, they had the pipelines and the connections and the refinery to do it. And at that point, Russia was insecure of her boundaries and reaching out. Nicholas II was forced to grant a constitution in 1905 at the time of the confrontation with the Japanese. It wasn't a great democracy, but in a way they were going to make some changes, and Russia was in the process of restructuring itself. In 1905, Charles Bonaparte, the direct relative of Napoleon Bonaparte, who was unsuccessful at conquering Russia, came to the United States, and he founded the Federal Bureau of Investigation that would be heavily anti-Russian, anti-communist, pro-counterintelligence, and working with organized crime. He was the founder of the FBI, Charles Bonaparte. He was the Secretary of Navy from 1905 to 1909, and he was the Attorney General in 1909 under Ted Roosevelt. There's a very good book out called The Russian Imperial Conspiracy, and it has to do with war plans and war booty and the work of Russia and the Tsars arranging World War I. This book dates the plans for World War I actually beginning in May in 1906, in March, meetings in Paris and then in London, and planning a harmonized attack of encircling Germany. They considered Germany a threat, and Great Britain was cementing its meetings with the British King and the Tsar as early as June 1908 to control Germany. The rationale behind it, according to this one source and some other sources that I've read to back it up, was that the Russians wanted to have control of the Dardanelles to get access to the world market for Russian products and extend their influence in the Balkans, and West Germany and Austria had to be controlled because of their influence also in the Balkans and in Austria, and that if Great Britain and Russia would ally against Germany, they could keep them from spreading out into those very rich territories. The French would go along with it because of the Alsace-Lorraine conflicts. There was iron mines in Lorraine and coal properties in the Saar Valley, and they suffered these indignities in what they called humiliations at the time of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, and wanted to break the growing power of Germany. This goes back that early, before World War I, to break the growing power of Germany, and Germany was building a navy which also then would threaten the British supremacy at sea. They were threatened by it, and one way that Russia thought that they could gain some strength in the Balkans and protect the British with their navy was to combine their energy against Germany, and they pinpoint a date of France and Russia meeting with Great Britain as early as 1892 to contemplate military operations against Germany, and these meetings were in secret, of course, have written up since and documented since, but it's this kind of meeting and conniving that takes place at a certain time, and then a few years later, on the flimsiest excuse of a man being shot, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the World War I broke out. It seems, according to history books, that there was more to that shooting, and there were a lot of heavy preparation taking place. The British Empire had a society called the Round Table Group of British aristocrats. It was secret. It was started by Lord Milner, and it was part of Cecil Rhodes' Trust to protect those great diamond mines and control that he had. This was in 1908, the same year that our FBI was founded, and it was the year of the founding of the Armanen Society, which would become the prototype of the Nazi secret societies later. The Round Table conspirators were formed in the U.S., and they were tied together by Colonel House from Texas, who was living in Great Britain with Herbert Hoover before World War I, and Colonel House, of course, helped sabotage the plans of Woodrow Wilson to end peace after the end of World War I. In 1908, when this was going on, William Buckley Sr., the father of James Buckley and William Buckley, the writer, and many other little Buckleys along the way, went to Mexico City working for Shell Oil, which was the Rothschilds' interest over in Europe, and the Rockefellers, representing Shell and Rockefeller in Mexico. He lived there from 1908 to 1924, and then went to Venezuela and controlled the Panapec Oil Company, which had oil holdings in Cuba that Fidel Castro confiscated, and also Venezuela Rockefeller oil interests down there. And, of course, the Buckley family have been involved with E. Howard Hunt, and later the assassination teams very closely when we get on further. And the Mexican assassination teams were important in the John Kennedy assassination. And Sirhan had contacts in Mexico, and also James Earl Ray was in Mexico. Mexico money was the biggest story to conceal at the time of Watergate. They used Gerald Ford, a member of Congress, to stop the banking committees from Wright-Patman from investigating the Mexican money connections as a conduit for the assassination teams. And in 1924, William Buckley Sr.'s headquarters for the oil interests representing Shell and Rockefeller was in Mexico, and then later in 24 he's off to Venezuela. In 1910, there was a meeting at the Jekyll Islands in Georgia, a secret meeting of bankers long preceding the Bilderbergers. It was a group of politicians, and they got together and began to put together the Federal Reserve Act, and they got out a publication called the Round Table Quarterly publication, which began in 1910. As I say, in 1912, there were these German orders, these pre-Nazi groups that were forming in 1912 from the humiliation of Germany being closed in by these other nations and being cut off. Germany was going to be cut off from its exploration, its boats and shippings overseas. And there were two organizations formed, one by George Lanz, L-A-N-Z, George Lanz von Liebenfeld, the Order of the New Templars, and Guido von List, the Armanon. These are the beginning of secret German societies which combined. They were earlier cults, and then they both combined together and started a group that would be interested in, quotes, courageous men, in quotes, to accomplish the work of combating social democrats. By 1912, the revolution had not taken place in Russia, but in 1905 there were labor conflicts and riots and disturbances in the Baku oil fields and around the world, and laborers were beginning to protest and organize, and the social democrats were to be put down by these cults that were better dead than commie, better dead than red, actually. And the defeat of Germany after Kaiser Wilhelm II's regime caused so much humiliation that the Germans had secret societies or angry young men, such as we have the Ku Klux Klan in this country and the Minutemen. There were these pockets of organizations that were to merge into Munich and form the Thule Society that Adolf Hitler was a part of. And the Thule Society was anti-Semitic, and they hated the Jews. They identified them with Karl Marx and their earlier doctrines and current doctrines of hating them, and they were looking for what they said was a Führer, and they braced their beliefs going back to Hindu religion and the structure of the society in India, of the racial purity and the stratas of society. They emulated themselves after the Indian caste society and formed the Thule Society. In 1913 was the introduction of the Federal Reserve System under Woodrow Wilson, that later was to be transferred over to the Treasury. And in 1913, the same year that was instigated, the Rockefeller Foundation was founded. We had the Rockefeller Medical Institute. In 1913 was the Rockefeller Foundation. In 1914 was the assassination of Archduke Francis Ferdinand of Austria. A Serbian terrorist was the person who sparked off World War I, and then the killing was off and the wars began to be numbered. The major wars, at least 10 million people died during this war, and with post-war famines and epidemics, more than 10 million died, but nobody seemed to learn any lesson from that. The monarchy began to be overthrown in Russia. The Bolsheviks had trouble fighting for the Tsar in this war, and the modern Soviet state was soon to come into existence. It was hard for Russia to fight this war and fight on the home front. In 1915, the Lusitania was sunk. That was sunk by the Germans. It was allowed to be sacrificed by the British and the U.S., and the purpose was to drum up hysteria against the Germans, again, afraid of fear of their expansion programs and taking mines and coal and the industries and then building their German fleets and ships. So the British and the United States allowed this to happen so that there would be anti-German feeling built up when the Lusitania was sunk. President Wilson began to submit some peace proposals to the warring nations in 1916, and that also was the same year that Rasputin, who had a tremendous influence over the Russian royal family, was killed. I can't do a rundown on his life and the politics now, but in another date we'll go into that. In 1917, the Russian Bolshevik Revolution broke out full scale. Mr. Kerensky was overthrown by the Bolsheviks, and Lenin was allowed to return to Russia to become the head of the Soviet Republic. By 1918, there was a total change on the face of Europe. The Volunteer Army of the United States was instigated to begin attacking the Bolsheviks. There's a very good book called The Volunteer Army. The information on this was sent to me by one of the researchers, and it's the story of the Allies entering into South Russia, where all these oil fields are, to control Russia after the revolution. And this is when the United States began putting troops into the Cossack territory to overthrow, even using German and Austrian fronts and Polish fronts to overthrow the government that was put in by the Russian people when they got rid of the Tsar. For a long time we had Americans and British on the border and even going into Soviet territory to do anything to stop the communists for taking hold once the Tsar was out. You can imagine the terror of the other countries in Germany and England and around the world and in Spain when the relatives of the Tsar were still in power as monarchists and the Tsar and his family were removed from power. It caused a hysteria throughout the world which has not ended to this day, even to the extent, I say, if they have to kill everyone on planet Earth, it's death to the finish against this very important date. So that we began setting up volunteer armies, and the Solidarists and the Vaslov's army were the Polish organizations and American and German organizations of Tsarist Russians that were kicked out to avenge this revolution. And then members of these groups were in the Dallas-Fort Worth area with Lee Harvey Oswald and Marina Oswald, and that's how I began to study this history, was studying the origins of these people in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. In 1919, when Woodrow Wilson was getting ready to sign his peace treaty, he was dying of a poison. He had been poisoned, and the Versailles Treaty was blocked. A dozen senators wanted to defeat Woodrow Wilson and get even with him for his Federal Reserve System that he instigated. That was one of the reasons. Henry Cabot Lodge controlled the Foreign Relations Committee, and as I said before, at the time that he was controlling the decisions on the Versailles Treaty and bucking Woodrow Wilson, the dying president at this time. Later his son is to lose the election in the Senate to John Kennedy and be part of the background of the military assassination teams in '63. In 1919, as soon as the revolution was a fact that the rest of the world had to face with, the Ku Klux Klan was revived in the United States, probably for fear that the blacks would organize in the same way that the Bolsheviks had organized or met in cells. So the terrorism of blacks looking at a white or talking with whites and breaking segregation was still impossible in the South, or in terms of educating them, because as I said before at the beginning of this tape, the dangerous fruit of knowledge is what would overthrow the power structure, and that's why there was such a bitter battle of John Kennedy to educate the blacks in the South during the Civil Rights Movement and bring in the troops. The South has fought the education of the blacks, and the North too. They're equal, but this was really the plus point of it all, and the hangings from the trees and the violence. And there are some good books out on the Klan now, but they revived at the time of the Russian Revolution, just as the Kulaguards, the hooded ones, began organizing in France to keep the masses from getting together so that they don't have to suffer the same fate of dividing their profits with the masses, or educating the masses, or housing them, or clothing them, or medicating them. And therefore the hysteria of the Klan was revived. The Thule Society in 1919 in Germany was recruiting Adolf Hitler, and Colonel House, the gentleman that helped against the fight against Woodrow Wilson's goals, who worked with Henry Cabot Lodge. Mr. House studied the internal affairs, international affairs very well, and founded the Royal Institute of International Affairs himself, which became another front or study after World War I on what to do with them. That's one of those institutions, like the Thule Society, the Institute of International Affairs. In 1919, when the Klan was organizing its muscles, the broader brand religion got full hold in South Africa. This was a cultural religion made up of Afrikaners and whites, and later in 1930, when we get to that time slot, they became the bulwark of the Nazi secret society Des Ahnen Urbe, And the broader bands became, after World War I, a tight religious organization opposed to social change, and then later went into apartheid, separating right after the war, like the concentration camps, the blacks from the whites, so that the mobility of education and opportunity became impossible. The broader bands, or the Afrikaners, were white people that lived down in Africa, that believed with their Dutch heritage that they were as much a part of Africa as the blacks. The church is based upon an intense defense mechanism of a white society, like the Philly Society. It is a secret cultural organization that got its muscle after the Russian Revolution. And this is important. These societies wouldn't be so intense if the Russian Revolution hadn't occurred. And the fear that they would be next, the intensity of the hatred and the secrecy of the organizations, I'm sure, wouldn't have been so combined, and a world force was beginning to start in different countries to oppose any possibility of a change such as took place in Russia. You see the Philly Society in Germany, the Afrikaners in South Africa, the Klan in the United States. The major countries are broadening their muscles, and the think tanks in Great Britain and the United States are also giving birth to what is later known as the Trilateral or the Bilderbergers, but it began right after the Russian Revolution. And in the case of the Afrikaners, the universities, the teachers, every teacher in the school is an Afrikaner teacher. Every principal was a member of the broader band. And as a matter of fact, the head of the broader band was Gerrit Viljoen, I'll give you his name if it means anything to you, who was president of what they called the Rand Afrikaans University. I think that's an interesting coincidence, if there are coincidences in history, because of the Rand think tank in California that works so closely with the Pentagon and the attempted control of the world through its various agents and servants to keep a handle on every country in order that it never become like the Soviet Union, where the masses or the people overthrow again the existing social order. In 1920, we moved to the next year. February 24th, 1920, was the beginning of the National Socialist movement, with the birth or the creation of Adolf Hitler, this person who was to represent the German interests all over the world. Germans around the world were anxious to rule Germany. They were revolting against the control Austria had with them. They wanted German self-determination, and they were spreading their German language in Brazil and Africa. And the pro-German movement inside Germany was very strong in 1920 after the war. They just weren't going to take the reparations or the scolding that came down on them. And wherever there's such intense anger or rearming or fighting for something, there usually is a grain of truth. If Russia and France and England were fighting World War I with the excuse of breaking the back of Germany, they certainly survived strong after World War I, and they were going to show these countries, like a big child with a temper tantrum. They hit too many bases at one time, trying to hit off England and the Soviet Union and so forth, but they were certainly going to show them that they were not inferior or second-class citizens, and they probably wanted the right to have navies and boats and take some of those goodies that Great Britain had managed for herself around the world, and at least share them, if not take control of them. Now, next week I'll just escalate a lot of dates and institutions that are important, but without this background it's hard to appreciate the conflicts that were set. And it's just a fraction of the whole story, but it's just a little bit of background on what, as I say, controls our future.